News accounts indicate that the Congress will leave town this week without acting on a federal stimulus bill to provide unrestricted, flexible funding to states and local governments. What's your reaction to that?
It's an insult to the thousands upon thousands of county workers, the thousand of county administered hospitals across this country, and the nearly 1,900 public health departments that have been on the front line of responding to this pandemic from before it hit the shores of this country. When the federal government asked for testing sites to be propped up, when they delivered aid to those that are unemployed and assisted those small businesses with PPP, all important steps. It was county governments, county government employees who were the boots on the ground making those connections, stretched beyond anything ever before, and we rose to that challenge. I don't know how they think these services get delivered without the resources to deliver them. County governments have not complained about our responsibility, but we are unified in this this demand and this need for Congress to recognize that their partners, us, our employees, are on the ground every day providing for the care and direct services to countless Americans who need their help.
Stephen?
Well, I'd like to add that the partisanship at the national level, at any level of government, is just, it's not acceptable. And the end result of the partisanship here was zero aid to state governments who serve 20 million people in New York State, and zero aid for counties in this state who serve 20 million people as well. It's shocking to be at this stage of December of this great pandemic without federal aid, direct federal aid. This translates into $500 million of cuts from the state to the county level. This translates to nearly $2 billion in lost sales tax revenue, and no direct aid from the federal government. We're in the midst of a national disaster, a natural disaster, and unlike any other time in American history, the federal government has not stepped up to reimburse state and local governments for an actual injury. It's unacceptable, it's unconscionable, and it's simply wrong.
County Executive, you talk about the impact to counties. What does this mean for the average New Yorker?
First, this is a gut punch to those who are providing those direct services. Today, millions of Americans will be staring at a weather forecast that brings inches upon inches of snowfall, impact to transportation, impact to the delivery of services, and it will be those hardworking government employees who are dedicated to providing services out on the streets plowing snow. The continued stress on local government, in particular the stress on county governments, cannot be shouldered indefinitely without the assistance of the federal government. Our residents, the average New Yorker, demands that we provide community policing through our sheriff's office. They need to know when they dial 911 that there's a dispatcher on the other end of the phone. They want to be sure that contact tracers are engaged in doing the work of containing this virus and responding to the pandemic. They know that if their children are at risk, that it's a county child protective services individual or a child advocacy center staff person who's out there responding to the need. When there is violence, and there has been growing domestic violence all these months, it is the advocates, the victims' advocates in the district attorney's offices and the partnerships that exist in the county sheriff's offices. These are the individuals that respond. Those very services are threatened, and they are diminished when the federal government doesn't necessarily see us as the partners we are, support us in our goal and responsibility providing the services they expect, and ultimately endangers and puts at risk the average New Yorker, the average American. That is shameful, and it is a punch to the gut of government, county government employees and leaders across the country.
Stephen, we're 2 weeks away from a new fiscal year and a new legislative session. What can we expect from the state of New York? What can counties expect from the state of New York going into 2021?
Well, the state has a very serious budget deficit. It was caused not through their own actions, but through the pandemic's response to the state. That will translate into cuts, cost shifts to local governments, reductions in services for counties. Let's put things in perspective. We're heading into January, February, March, very tough time of year to do road construction work. But for snowplows, we find ourselves, because of the pandemic, using more heavy equipment because of individuals being in those trucks, so that we have people separated, more trucks, more fuel expenditures because we have more trucks on the road. It's going to be very difficult to perform these governmental services without state revenue. And the state of New York has a structural deficit now. The governor has pegged that at $60 billion. This is going to matter to school districts. This is going to matter to local governments as we go through these next few months. The federal government had a role in this and helping us through this pandemic. They chose not to, and focusing on individual actions instead of collective actions for the state and local governments.
County Executive, what would you recommend a viewer of this podcast say to their congressional member or state legislator after hearing the news that there will not be a stimulus package coming to New York or our county governments? What should they say to their legislative leader?
The average New Yorker, the individual listening or viewing this message, knows someone in county government who has been working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since January of this year. They know the driver of the snowplow as it goes by their home. They know the dispatcher on the other end of the 911 call. They know the local volunteer emergency or career emergency responder. They are their friends, their neighbors. In some cases, they are their loved ones in their homes. They should pick up the phone. They should call or text or email their federal representative. Reach out to friends in other states and have them do the same. And make it very, very clear. Never before in the history of America has the federal government left its local government partners to fend for themselves. When I say fend for themselves, it's not the county executives and the county legislators who are out doing this alone. It is the average New Yorker who's working a middle-class job, stretched too thin, trying to make ends meet for their family, whose livelihood is now being threatened, and ability to do the work they care for. They pour their hearts and souls into delivering these services. They know how critical they are. It is them. It is their livelihoods and ability to provide those services that now is threatened. And we need federal representatives to understand that. We're doing our job, and they ought to do theirs.
Stephen Acquario, we've talked about a triple threat facing county governments: loss in sales tax revenue, cuts in state reimbursement, and increased demand for services. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we call it a triple threat because there's three major impacts to us. When the federal government didn't act to help the state of New York, who is in desperate need of federal assistance, that translates into reductions, eliminations of state funding for very important programs. We are talking across the board cuts. If you're a not-for-profit serving in your community, you're looking at a cut. If you are a mental health provider, you're looking at a cut. If you are in public health, you're looking at a cut. If you're in public safety, you're looking at a cut. Mental health, transportation, mass transit, every single public program runs through a county government. All of that is likely to be significantly reduced, and that's going to have some very serious problems. The federal government, let's look at it this way. Government serves the public at large. It does for individuals what they themselves cannot do. That's why it exists. That's why county governments have an emergency 911 system. When an individual in Wappinger Falls picks up the phone and calls for help, they expect somebody to come help them. That's the job of Mark Molinaro and the Dutchess County 911 system. They provide that service. The public demands that service. That's not a mandated service from the state of New York. That's a publicly mandated service. They expect that service to be there. When we're facing these cuts and we don't get relief from the federal government to help with this pandemic, it just has a cascading effect for all the services, for infrastructure, we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic. How are we going to help people? We have suicides, public health challenges with the pandemic, helping families, temporary assistance to needy families, feeding the poor, the safety net of society. That's county government, and the federal government let us down.
Anything to add, County Executive, before we wrap up?
I think that there needs to be one really important appreciation that Steve just mentioned, and I'll reinforce it. We at the county level provide those things most directly that individuals can't provide on their own. I mean, governments are put on this planet and have been supported within this country to meet the collective needs of a community. There has never before been a confluence of more collective needs than right now. The response to a public health crisis, the pandemic, the response to violence, racism, intolerance, the civil unrest, and the ability to bridge divides. That's not happening by and from elected leaders in Washington. That's happening on the ground, the boots on the ground, the community leaders on the ground, the human rights commissions on the ground administered by county governments. Add to that weather conditions and an uptick in violence, the uptick in concern regarding mental wellness and substance uses. Are all of these things converging? We're not asking for a bailout. In fact, it's insulting to think that we would. We're asking for partners, for Washington to set aside the partisan paralysis that too often infects it, to see their local government partners, not as Republicans or Democrats, blue counties or red counties, blue states or red states, but rather the conduit to direct service to residents. Every day, I've spent every day of my adult life as an elected official. I was a village mayor for 12 years. Residents turn to us because they know us, they trust us, they count on us. We are not going to let them down. Washington ought not let us down in delivering that critical service to residents.